Hello there and welcome to The UK Decides, our special coverage of the UK general election right here on Arabiya English. Now, today, Thursday in the UK, is the day polling booths have been open for the British public to go and vote for who they want to be the leader of the United Kingdom heading into the future. For that reason, we won't be focusing on domestic politics as much in today's coverage, but talking more about the UK's partnership with countries around the world, an international focus, if you like, and how elections like the UK's has an impact on geopolitical events. Starting things off, we will, of course, be looking at the conflict in Gaza. I'm pleased to say joining me in the studio to discuss this in more detail is the Palestinian ambassador to the UK, Husam Zomlot. Great to see you. Thank you very much for making time for us. We have gathered you here in the week of the UK election as we host this special coverage to get your impression, not only to give us the insight of what's happening in Gaza currently, but to get your impression of the role that Britain plays when it comes to supporting Gaza. Of course, we've got the general election happening here on Thursday. The current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, for the last 9 months, has spoken about being shocked by the bloodshed in Gaza, but also talked about Israel's right to defend itself. What do you make of his handling of the situation?
First of all, Rosanna, it's very important to stress our strategy that Palestine is not a partisan issue. It isn't a party issue. Palestine should be a UK issue, an international issue, because it is an issue of human rights, it's an issue of international law, and it's an issue of people's inalienable rights that are not up for discussion. Whoever comes in government, whoever forms the next government, is expected to make sure that the UK long-held policy, the UK commitment to international law, and the UK historic legal and political and moral responsibilities towards the Palestinian people since the Balfour Declaration and that colonial era that has seen the UK, Great Britain at the time, contributing to the agony of the Palestinian people. This is a moment when we want to see leadership, a true leadership, that to focus on the root cause of the situation, not dance around it, not mince the words. And that requires true leadership. Whoever comes in government next is expected to really be at the level of the British people. And you've seen the British people over the last few months. I mean, the level of solidarity, the intensity, the unity, the diversity. They need to listen to their own people. And I'm sure you followed some of the opinion polls, an opinion poll after another. The overwhelming majority of the British people are with an immediate and permanent ceasefire. Any government must listen and adhere to their own people if they are a democratic government. The vast majority of the British people want to see arms embargo being imposed while the International Court of Justice is looking at the case of genocide committed by Israel, brought by South Africa, the issue of making sure that international law is applied equally, accountability, the settlement expansion in the West Bank, the settler violence and terrorism. They are on the rampage all over the West Bank. It's the deadliest year in the West Bank so far, 2023, 2024. So this isn't about a particular party or a particular prime minister or a particular government. This is about the UK. And Palestine is a cross-party issue and should be a United Kingdom issue rather than a certain part. However, having said all that, the current government, led by Rishi Sunak, and for the last few years, have not really delivered what was expected from the United Kingdom.
And that's what I want to pick you up on, because we've listed a lot there of factors that will come into play in this election, depending on who is elected, how they handle things. But Britain does have a role when it comes to Palestine and Palestinian people. You've already mentioned the Balfour Declaration, and we talk about Palestinian statehood as well, recognising the state and sovereignty of Palestine. So let's take those issues one by one. How close do you think it is possible that Britain will formally recognise a state of Palestine?
Of course, and it should have happened long time ago. And Britain has missed so many opportunities, at least since 1988, when we declared a state in accordance with international legitimacy, international law, international resolutions, in accordance with the UK policy, two-state solution. It missed 1999, 5 years since the Oslo Accords. There was an agreement that the world will recognize the state of Palestine. The UK missed. In 2012, we went to the UN to seek UN membership. The UK missed. abstained. In 2017, the century, the 100 years of the Balfour Declaration, that was a moment of true historic proportions, because the UK, after 100 years, Britain has seen the consequences of its Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration has cancelled the Palestinian people, has attempted to cancel. They didn't succeed to cancel. And then 100 years of Nakba, of ethnic cleansing, of occupation and subjugation, of apartheid, of besiegement, and now genocide. That was a moment after 100 years to say, oops, we have a responsibility. And our responsibility now entails that we resolve this conflict based on our international commitments. That didn't happen. So today we're telling UK politicians right across the board, this is your moment. And should you miss it, then don't give us policy lines and lip service and some washy statements. You have got to deliver. Now action more than words that are really needed. So the issue of recognition is paramount because A, it corrects history, it uncancels the Palestinian people, and it does extract a clear acknowledgement by the UK that the cancellation process that has lasted for 107 years has failed. But it's also an inalienable right for the Palestinian people. This is not a gift, this is not a favor by anybody. This is our sacred birthright that should have been granted long time ago. It's long overdue. Second, it levels the field. So at least we stop talking about Israel and the Palestinians, and therefore Israel interprets this as a license to grab more land, and you know what happened over the last 30 years. I mean, the illegal colonial settlements quadrupled. It levels the field, it becomes Israel and Palestine. Then the conversation is no longer about principles. The principle of the right to self-determination to people, this is non-negotiable. The principle that people should go back to their homes and farms and properties, this is non-negotiable. The principle of equality under the law, this is unnegotiable. But then we sit as Israel and Palestine, as two states, to discuss modalities, to discuss minor details. That's why recognition is important. And also, of all that, it really sends the right message at the right time to everybody that hope is there, that there is a different tomorrow, that we can shape a different future. And you know, when you lose hope, when helplessness and hopelessness is spreading, then this is the most worrying sign. So we hope that the new government is going to recognize the state of Palestine as per their own commitment. Both the conservatives and the Labour, and by the way, and the Liberal Democrats and all the other parties have committed to recognizing the state of Palestine. But they always manage to insert a word somewhere that would delay this process. We tell them, after 30 years of delaying this process, look where you got us. You gotten us to a genocide. So this is a moment when you correct all these mistakes, and a moment when you set us on a clear path, because the lack of clarity over the last 30 years is what has led to this awful, horrible situation. We now need clarity.
Tell me, from those diplomatic conversations that you have here in the UK with the current government or with other people that are vying to get into government, how specific you are with the wording that you want to see about the Balfour Declaration. Because could you imagine a situation in which the UK formally recognises the state of Palestine, but there isn't some sort of acknowledgement of the Balfour Declaration as well? Do you need to see both happening at the same time?
Yes, and we need to see an apology. The Palestinian people have been going through the most traumatic experience a nation can go through. 107 years of chronic, systematic, ongoing, non-stop attempts at erasing us. It's a process of erasure. In 1917, the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, colonial Britain, promised our land without consulting us and turned us, the native population, at the time 98% of the population owning 96% of the land and the properties, turned us into non-Jewish minorities. So all of a sudden, we are defined by what we are not. And since then, Britain took over Palestine, the mandate, in 1920, all the way to 1948. And it was supposed to, as per its own commitment to the League of Nations at the time, to prepare the Palestinian people for statehood, to prepare the Palestinian people, you know, the colonial mindset, to prepare us for independence. Instead, what they prepared us for, the Nakba, the catastrophe, the ethnic cleansing of 2/3 of our people, and the destruction of more than 520 of our towns, cities, and villages, including my own parents and grandparents. That's why I was born in a refugee camp. And then The first attempt at cancellation was 1917, the Balfour Declaration, and Britain has got to take responsibility of that. They have attempted at that time to cancel a nation that has lived there all of its life, millennia. And by the way, Palestine is not just any other country. Palestine is the cradle of civilizations, the hub between East and West, the link, the birthplace of Christianity. I mean, this is an ancient nation. And therefore, that's how it started. It continued another cancellation in the Nakba and the ethnic cleansing. It continued via the military occupation of 1967 and the apartheid system and the besiegement and the walls and the killings and what have you. And now we are going through a genocide. So this is a moment when the world, including the UK, number one on the list is the UK, must come out and say enough is enough. We have to acknowledge that our attempts to cancelling the Palestinian people have failed. We're here. We're here.
Talk to me then about the momentum of the support for Palestine that you have seen and for Palestinians here in the UK. You mentioned it before. You feel like you've been well supported here in the United Kingdom over the last 9 months. Of course, it's been deeply divisive. Those supporting Israel, those supporting Palestinians in the streets, it's become a domestic and divisive issue. But do you still feel that you have that continued momentum of support from the public that could put pressure on politicians here to make a statement?
Rosanna, I didn't see any divisive part of the solidarity in the last 9 months, at least, or for the last many years, but it has really been very special, very inspiring in the last 9 months. I haven't seen divisions. I've seen unity. I've seen unity. I've seen representatives of the components of the British people. I've seen festive moods among them, and this weekend you will have another one, and every weekend you have a huge national demo. I've seen the sustainability of this, because historically, when something like this happened, usually people go out to the streets for a week, for 2, for a month, but to keep going for 9 months and still increasing, growing, is historic in every sense. And you're talking about millions, and not just in London. In London, in Manchester, in Scotland, in Wales, in smaller cities. I was in Bournemouth just very recently. It just warms your heart. This small city had seen the biggest demo in support of Palestine, to end the genocide in Gaza, for a permanent ceasefire, all that. But also the activism, the student movement. I mean, 30 campuses in the UK now are in encampments. And this is historic. It happens only once in a few generations' time. The last time such a thing happened was 1968, the anti-Vietnam War, and of course linked to the US student movement. The labor movement here, not the Labour Party, the labor movement here. I mean, in the last month and a half, 2 months, I have literally addressed almost every single major trade union congress here. You're talking about thousands, and you're talking about a real base of the labor movement. So, no, the solidarity and all the indicators are like when the vast majority of the British people are with an immediate recognition of the state of Palestine, of course, with an immediate and permanent ceasefire, with arms embargo immediately on Israel. You're talking about 70%, 80%, 90%. When they are with the full application of international law at the ICC and the ICJ, then you know that you have got the public opinion. The issue here is the growing gap between those in government and their own people. And this is an issue that has to do with democracy and how democracies work. The gap is actually increasing, not decreasing. And our job, especially in light of the upcoming elections, is to reduce this gap so any government is actually representing the true feelings and the true support and the true principles of its own people and their own values. I mean, any party that would form the next government should have certain values. The Conservatives believe in global Britain and international law. We haven't seen much of that vis-à-vis Palestine. Labour believe not only in that, but in justice and freedom and social justice and political justice. We need to see that. So we need to work with them not only on the basis of what we expect, but what they have promised.
And we'll have to wait and see how that outcome works on Friday after everyone has gone to the polling booth. But we really appreciate your time today and coming to talk to us about how this affects the situation in Gaza. Ambassador of the State of Palestine to the UK, Husam Zomlot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, as we continue to assess the ramifications of the general election in the UK on the UK's international relations around the world and other elections this year around the world too, let's go back to discussing the situation between Israel and Hamas. I can now speak to the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert. Mr. Olmert, thank you very much for making time for us. And let's begin with the news of the day, of the evening. Reports that they have, if they haven't already, assembled some meetings amongst the security cabinet there in Israel on the basis of this renewed list that could form the basis of a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, and even that we may have a conversation happening between Benjamin Netanyahu and Joe Biden. How likely do you think it is that we're reaching a ceasefire status?
I must be very honest with you. I have no idea. I can say what I think should be, but I'm not familiar with the specific details which may be discussed now at the War Cabinet, and so I think it will be a little bit presumptuous on my side to offer any assessment. I can say that, as far as I'm concerned, I think the war should be stopped now. There is no merit of any significance that I can see for continuing the military confrontation. For all practical purposes, Israel won this military confrontation. Hamas has been weakened dramatically. Most of the tunnels and the command positions and the launchers and the rockets were destroyed. And now it's time to bring back all the hostages as soon as possible. And if there is indeed a new, somewhat more flexible approach by Hamas, which may allow an agreement about ceasefire and the return of hostages, I'd very much support it.
From what you've seen of the way that Netanyahu has handled preceding attempts at negotiations of a ceasefire situation with Hamas, can you see him getting to a position, Benjamin Netanyahu himself, where he will accept some of the grounds for ceasefire?
Well, on the one hand, I hear that he has authorized those who are in charge of the hostages to go to Qatar to continue the negotiations, which is a positive sign. On the other hand, based on the experience we have with Netanyahu, we know that at some point, when it came to be very close to a conclusion, he somehow manipulated it in order to prevent it. So the question is, what is at stake here? And it's likely that the partners of Netanyahu, the right-wing, extreme right-wing groups of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, are very much against this deal. If they threaten him that in the event that he will accept the deal and will cease fire, they will leave the government, then based on the experience we have with Netanyahu, he will prefer his government interest and the stability of his coalition over the national interest of Israel. So I'm afraid that it may not take place, but I think it's a little bit too early that I will pass any final judgment on this. We have to see how it develops.
I appreciate that, that you want to sort of avoid speculation. However, when you talk about the way that Netanyahu has prioritised certain aspects of his government over the situation, do you see a world in which Benjamin Netanyahu will face some sort of charges, if not the ICC arrest warrant, but then something domestically in Israel in the future?
Look, to be very honest with you, I'm not a supporter of Netanyahu. Perhaps I'm one of his staunchest rivals, and I do and I will do everything in my power, together with many others, to get rid of him as soon as possible. But I don't think that he should be charged individually and personally with war crimes. I don't think that there has been any order by anyone in Israel, nor the Prime Minister, neither anyone else, to shoot indiscriminately against Palestinians any place. I know, and I apologize, and I admit that thousands of innocent Palestinians have been killed as a result of this military operation because of the complexity, because of the fact that the Hamas murderers are embedded inside the urban centers, underground the hospitals and the mosques and the schools and public facilities and also private homes, and it becomes increasingly difficult to reach out for them and not to hit sometimes, unfortunately, also innocent civilians. But I don't think that there has been any policy, any calculation to bring about events that can justify charges against Netanyahu or any of the Israelis in the criminal court.
Now, you mentioned. Go ahead.
I'm not certain that he will not be charged, because I heard that he was already been warned by the attorney of the criminal court. So I don't know to say.
In terms of the civilians that have lost their lives in Gaza, the Hamas-linked or the Hamas-run health ministry citing that figure at nearly 38,000 currently. So there is mass international pressure coming from different countries around the world, the US being one of those. There's certainly quarters of the United Kingdom, some that support what Israel is doing, some that want to see ceasefire immediately, some that are terribly concerned about those numbers and what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza. How do you think support is for Israel these days? I know it's hard to kind of summarise that on a global scale, but do you feel you still have the support of some of your closest allies in this conflict?
I think that the support Israel is eroding rapidly. There's no question about it. I think that most of the countries that were supporters of Israel in the first place are still supporters and friends of the state of Israel and the people of Israel, but not necessarily of the government of Israel. There is a clear distinction now growing up in a very clear way. It's true about America, and I think it's true about Europe as well. People and leaders, whether it is Biden or Rishi Sunak, or President Macron or Scholz or anyone in Europe, they all know the qualities, the values, the spirit of the Israeli people. They can't stand, as we can't stand, the arrogance and the brutality of Netanyahu. And what you see now is a growing distrust and a lack of confidence in the way that Netanyahu handles himself vis-à-vis the international community, as well as vis-à-vis the issues that we are facing now. And that probably will damage the status of Israel and the interest of the state of Israel. But this is a result of the attitude towards the prime minister. I think this is not a dramatic or fundamental change in the basic attitude of these countries towards the state of Israel and the people of Israel.
Quite simply, I'm going to ask you, would you support a two-state solution?
Yeah, I think I'm the first one that has been spelling it out in the most explicit manner time and again, time and again. I presented President Mahmoud Abbas in 2008, when I was Prime Minister of Israel, with a comprehensive peace plan based on the 67 borders, two-state solution on the basis of the 67 borders, with minor modifications, swaps of territories and annexation of a little bit, within the framework of what was also proposed by President Bush when he was president. And this is something that was accepted by, I think, me and Abu Mazen. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, the Palestinian president didn't sign what I've proposed to him, which may have changed history, may have changed the lives of millions of people here and in the surrounding areas, regrettably. But I definitely am in favor of this. I don't see that there is any other possible political solution for this historical conflict. It's not simple, it's complex, it's sensitive. It may still involve many difficulties that we have to overcome together with the Palestinians, but two sides have to have a leadership that will be determined and committed and with a vision that will be prepared to engage immediately in negotiations towards the solution, which the major part of the solution will be two states. There is one already, which is the state of Israel, creation of a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel.
Just wrapping up, now we really appreciate your insights, but I just want to ask you, with the US election coming into view later this year in November, is the world a safer place, do you think, under President Trump or President Biden?
You know, thank you for not asking me what do I think about the elections in Great Britain today and the possible elections in France. I can say this, as far as Israel is concerned, I'm not in a position to determine or to suggest for the United States what's good for America. I can say that President Biden is an exceptionally friendly, supportive, committed, and loyal friend of the State of Israel, and I have enormous respect for him. I know him personally. I've worked with him in the past when he was not president and I was prime minister, and I found him to be the most decent, committed friend of the State of Israel, and I thank him for everything that he did for the State of Israel. What will happen in America, I'll leave to America.
And can I just ask you why you wouldn't want to comment on the UK or French elections?
Oh, because for the same reason, I don't think that an Israeli, certainly not a former prime minister of Israel, should offer his involvement in a domestic political process. I can say the same thing about Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and President Macron. They were exceptionally friendly and supportive of the State of Israel, and Israelis admire them for this support. I know that in Great Britain, Mr. Starmer, the head of the Labour Party, is very friendly to the State of Israel, but who will be elected and what will be the makeup of the British Parliament and the French Parliament, I think the British and the French should decide, and we should respect their decision.
A diplomacy point then. Look, we really appreciate the time you've given to us, former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert.
Thank you.
Joined now by former Defence Secretary Sir Michael Fallon. Sir Fallon, good to see you. Thank you. Let's talk then about defence spending, because it's a key policy point of any election. And going into this one, both Labour and the Conservatives say they're aiming for 2.5% of GDP on defence spending when they can, basically, up to 2030, when the funding is available. There's a lot of conflict, a lot of geopolitical instability at the moment. Is that even enough?
Probably isn't enough in the longer term, but it's a recognition, I think, by both parties that we do have to raise our defence spending. If you go back to the turn of this century, long before 9/11 or conflicts in the Middle East or Iran developing its missile programmes or terrorism, we were spending 2.7% already. So, it has reduced in recent years, and it now, the world is more dangerous now. And we have these different conflicts on our own continent, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, further tension in the Indo-Pacific. And these conflicts are sort of merging now. You have Hamas leaders, for example, being received in Moscow. You have North Korea supplying weapons into Ukraine. So, the West is up against it, and we do now need to look at our defence spend.
And some of that defence spending will, of course, go on weapons manufacture and export, support for Ukraine, etc. But quite a lot will be going into building our own armed forces and defence at home. During the most recent Conservative government, there's been criticism that the armed forces, particularly the army, has been in decline and that we're a weakened power and we're weakened defences. Is that fair?
The army has declined in size. I fixed it at the time of the defence review that I did back in 2015. I fixed it at 82,000. It's only just over 70,000 now. But of course, it isn't just men and women serving. It is also what the army can do. It's what's called its lethality. It's the kind of weapons that it needs. And I think we're learning now quite a lot from the conflict in Ukraine and indeed the conflict in the Middle East that, we need to improve our missile defence. We need to have the ability to shoot down other people's missiles. And we need to be, spending more on some of the new technologies, particularly in cyber and dealing with drones and the rest of it.
Can you see that kind of investment being made in a Labour government if they win?
Well, they've pledged to meet the same target of 2.5%, but they haven't said by when. And that's at the moment is the key difference between the parties. Conservatives have said they'll do it by 2030. And I hope, by the way, that NATO will adopt a new target like 2.5% at the Washington summit the week after this. But Labour haven't been clear as to when they'll meet it. And of course, they've pledged to carry out a defence review. We've actually had at least 3 reviews in recent years, so I'm not sure we need a wholesale review. But I very much hope that if they do win the election, then they will commit to a firm timetable so that we can see defence spending rising year on year throughout the next parliament, because that's what it needs now, given how dangerous the world is.
Various commentary from some on the right in this country, some of the conservative political ranks as well, that Labour aren't serious about defence, that somebody like President Putin over in Russia is hoping that Labour get in because it will make the UK a weak power and weak on defence. You know, those kind of words, that kind of rhetoric is being used to allege that the Labour Party will be weak on defence. Do you think that's fair?
Well, they could have answered it by giving a firm commitment as to when they would meet 2.5%. And I think it is interesting they've chosen not to do that. So obviously defence isn't quite the priority for them as some of the other issues that they've put in their manifestos, and that's disappointing. On the other hand, clearly, they have moved away from where Jeremy Corbyn was, for example, in not calling Russia out over the attacks in Salisbury and not being firm enough on how we need to support Ukraine. So they've moved a bit, clearly, from the last general election, but they haven't yet moved, as far as they need to in terms of a firm commitment.
In terms of those numbers in the army, the British army, that you say you got up under when you were defence secretary, and the way it's declined since. Well, a headline grabber in previous months from Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was that he would hope for conscription. That young people in this country would have to form some sort of national service in order to get those numbers up. Would you support that?
Well, you see other countries in Europe now saying that they do need to introduce not some form of conscription, but some way of encouraging young people when they're leaving college, to consider, to apply, actually, almost in a competitive way, to apply for various places on a scheme like that. That's becoming quite common now in Scandinavia and other European countries. And it is certainly worth looking at. Now, traditionally, national service, which a lot of people would like to see reintroduced compulsorily for everybody, traditionally the armed forces themselves have never really supported that, because it consumes a large part of the budget just in training hundreds of thousands of young people who will then leave immediately and never have anything to do with the military ever again. So it's got to be fought through. But yes, there is an issue there. First, of numbers, making sure the army and the navy particularly have the people that they need. But also, I think, in binding in our young people to understanding that the military are there for all of us. And it isn't just something that can be permanently contracted out to a professional army.
But you would like to see those who are motivated joining, rather?
I'd like to see them, flesh this out. And I think the Prime Minister said he would have a commission to look at it. There are countries where people compete to take up the places, and then employers know that these are the most employable, the most ambitious people, and they're therefore highly desirable to employ. So I think we need to turn it round and make it something that young people should aspire to. So it's going to need a bit of work, but there it is. It's in the manifesto as a Conservative commitment.
Now, we've touched on Ukraine already, but let's talk about where we're at, because it's more than 2 years this war has ground on for now. Former NATO Secretary General recently claiming that Putin's Plan A in Ukraine has failed. It fears the war will become a frozen conflict. Do you share those fears?
Well, it's gone on for a long time, not just since the invasion in 2022, but down in the southeast of Ukraine, it's gone on since 2014, when Putin first annexed Crimea and started the war down in the Donbass in the southeast region. So it's already gone on for 10 years. And Ukraine has shown no sign at all that it wants to give up any of its territory on any kind of permanent basis. And that is Ukraine's right. It has the right to defend itself. It has the right to ask its friends for help under the United Nations Charter. And while Ukraine has that position, then we in the West should be helping them. And we have an interest in doing that, because Putin has made it clear that he won't simply stop at Ukraine. Now, he didn't stop last time after 2014. He came back 8 years later and invaded the whole country. He's already made it clear that he'd like to see those countries that the near abroad to Russia brought back within Moscow's ambit. So there are countries now like Transnistria, part of Moldova, Georgia, the Baltic states, that are extremely vulnerable if Putin isn't stopped in Ukraine. So this isn't just a matter for the security of Ukraine. It affects the security of all of us.
So I'm to take it you don't agree with Nigel Farage's comments in the past week
No,
that
I
the
was
West
shocked.
provoked Russia?
I was shocked. I mean, we certainly didn't provoke Russia. It's nonsense. Half of Russia's neighbours aren't actually in NATO. NATO isn't a threat to Russia. NATO is a defensive alliance which countries are free to join. But what really shocked me was Farage was one of the champions of Brexit, of national sovereignty. It seems to be all right for us to choose whether we want to be in Europe or not, but he's saying Ukraine should not have the right as a democracy to choose its future path. And the plain fact is Ukraine voted. They voted to leave the old Soviet Union. They voted to set off on this path towards the European frameworks, whether it's NATO or the European Union, and they're fully entitled to do that.
Let's stay with the theme of sovereignty, but talk about Palestinians, Palestinian statehood and sovereignty. Of course, the conflict in Gaza is still horrifying, still going on, again, grinding on. What role do you see for the UK in supporting Palestinian statehood and sovereignty?
Well, I think the UK, with the other friends of Palestine, first of all, has got to put on the maximum pressure to make sure this war comes to an end, and then both sides have got to rethink where the future lies. How do we ensure that Israel has secure borders that it can live within without being attacked either by Hamas or indeed Hezbollah? And how do we ensure the Palestinians too have a viable state that they can belong to and that can support itself? But the first thing is to get the war stopped, to get a permanent ceasefire, and to ensure that we can then move on to the next stage, which is planning a more secure future for both sides.
And absolutely critical, many say, in securing the kind of peace plans and progress that people want to see in the world to end these conflicts is the United States, which of course is also heading to the polls later this year. We're seeing currently Joe Biden facing off against Donald Trump. Who is the world safer with?
Well, it's not really for us to judge which way the Americans should vote. They must take that decision, for themselves. I was Defence Secretary under Trump's first year, and we've had President Biden ever since then. What is required is leadership. And what I don't think is going to help an increasingly dangerous world is if America further withdraws from it. So it is really important whoever wins does resume the role of American leadership and does put sufficient emphasis on the key alliances, the NATO alliance in Europe, the alliance, for example, with Britain and Australia in Indo-Pacific after the new AUKUS deal, and the other arrangements that we have amongst the democracies for working together as alliances. That's important. Now, last time Trump was president, if he wins again, last time there was a lot of noise from Trump, but in the end, he did support NATO. He wanted European countries to spend more, so they should. But he did support NATO, and he came across and made a very good speech in Warsaw, I remember, in his first year, about the importance of the alliance working together. So I hope whoever wins will, recommit to American leadership, but also to American involvement in these important alliances. NATO is 75 now. NATO has kept the peace, if you like, has defended our freedoms. And, it's important that America resumes that leadership.
Former Defence Secretary Sir Michael Fallon, we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's return to matters here in the UK now and talk about what the outcome of the election could be tomorrow, what that means for the parties, the main parties involved, and for the future of Britain. I'm pleased to say, joining me here in the studio is the former president of YouGov, which is a polling organisation in the United Kingdom and internationally. He's also a well-regarded pollster, Peter Kellner. Peter, thank you very much for making time.
Pleasure.
Now, we'll have to wait and see what comes out of the voting today when we get the election results tomorrow. But most polls have been pointing towards a Labour landslide. If we do indeed see Labour getting into power, will we see them getting into power for a couple of terms? Will it be necessarily them for 10 years?
This is a question I'm asked a lot, and it would look as if it should be for 10 years because it looks like being a very big victory. And it's a victory much more because people hate the outgoing government than love
the incoming Labour government. But when a party wins as big as Labour is winning this election, you'd normally expect them to win 2 terms. But I would give one word of caution, because I remember 5 years ago after the last election, a lot of us thought the Conservatives who won that election would be in for 10 years, and yet they're out on their ear after 5 years. So one of the things that's happening in Britain, and I think in many other countries, is that a lot of voters are much more volatile than they used to be. The old pattern of manual working class people voting on the left, middle class, well-off people voting to the right and staying that way election after election, that's gone, completely gone. People are moving around as never before. So I wouldn't say definitely that Labour will be in for 10 years. Probably yes, definitely no.
So in terms of what we're seeing in Europe, which is an interesting comparison point, because we're seeing voters trending slightly further right to certain parties there. And yet here in the UK, we'll again have to wait the outcome of the election tomorrow, but we could see a swing to the left, or at least the centre left. Is that purely down to protesting against the current government, the Conservative government?
There is a lot of protest against the current government. It's going to end up losing about half its vote. That's never happened. So the Conservatives are only governing party in Britain before. But within that, there is a surge to the right. One of the reasons why the Conservatives are doing so badly is a chunk of their vote is going to the Reform Party, a new right-wing populist party. And to that extent, what's happening in Britain is not dissimilar to what's happening across Europe. But the difference is our voting system. Britain has a first-past-the-post voting system, and it means the Reform Party is going to end up with around 14 or 15% of the votes, I would expect, when the votes are finally all counted, but they're only going to have 1, 2, 3 members of Parliament, whereas the Liberal Democrats, a party that's also benefiting from the government's unpopularity, more to the centre or centre-left, is going to end up with fewer votes than Reform, but it's going to end up with 40 or 50 seats. So what's happening is the first past the post is shaping and, if you like, distorting the pattern of behaviour in Britain. So while you have at the macro level a shift to the left, below the surface you're getting a surge to the right.
I'm glad you brought up the first past the post system. I was going to ask you about exactly that, because you specialise in electoral processes, and there is often a lot of debate about whether there should be electoral reform in this country to get rid of the first past the post system, head towards more proportional representation. Do you think we could see that happening?
You're not going to see it in the coming Parliament, because Labour will have and will enjoy the fact that it has a very big majority of probably less than 40% of the vote. If nothing else, you're going to have something like 400 Labour members of Parliament who, if we had a proportional system, a quarter, a third, half of them will be voting themselves out of a job. So it's not going to happen during this Parliament. But look a bit further ahead. In a future election, Labour might need the support of another party, like the Liberal Democrats, maybe the Greens, sometime in the future. And one of the prices they will demand for supporting a Labour government which doesn't quite get enough seats to govern on its own, they will want proportional representation. And the very weirdness of the results tonight, the mismatch between seats and votes, will be part of their argument. And I think a lot of people in the country will say, yeah, it isn't quite right to have such a mismatch. Maybe we do need a different voting system. So not now, but maybe in 5 years' time.
Interesting stuff. Look, you talked about the current government likely being out on their ear, to use your terms, and one of the significant parts of that is that Rishi Sunak, the current Prime Minister up until today, maybe tomorrow, who knows, but he could also lose his seat as a Member of Parliament. How significant is that?
No Prime Minister in British history has ever lost their own seat. There have been a couple of occasions when a Prime Minister has given up the premiership 3 or 4 months before an election, and then like Ramsay MacDonald, the first Labour Prime Minister, he resigned as Prime Minister in the summer of 1931, and later that year he lost his seat, but he wasn't any longer Prime Minister. If Rishi Sunak loses his seat in a few hours' time, that will be an absolute first. But, you know, I reckon of 23 cabinet ministers, 20 of them are standing for election again, and probably at least half of them will lose their seats. So it wouldn't be that extraordinary in that context if Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, was one of them.
Just to wrap things up, I want to ask you whether you think we're going to see more of personality politics or even more populism when it comes to United Kingdom politics.
Oh, and that's a really interesting question. You do see it a bit now. In fact, you've seen it at one level developing over my lifetime. When I was growing up, it was very much party against party, because it's a parliamentary, not a presidential system. But as we moved into television debates between contenders, Prime Minister versus would-be Prime Minister, it has become very much more personalised. But you've also seen, quite particularly in Nigel Farage, the leader of the right-wing, very nationalist Reform Party, there you see very much a populist personality as well as a leader of a populist politics party. So I regret the fact, but I think I have to admit the fact, that we are moving steadily more and more and more towards personality, sub-presidential type contest.
Peter Kellner, great to get your insight. Thank you. Well, now that the British public have been at the polling booths all day deciding on the future, who is going to lead the United Kingdom into the future, we'll now have to await the results. Lots of people will be up all night watching coverage, speculating endlessly. It will take many, many hours until we really know who is the next Prime Minister. So until that time, let's have a bit of fun, shall we? A bit of light relief and some political analysis with our excellent panel here in the studio in London for our special coverage. I'd like to welcome to the studio Paula, Rhone, Adrien, lawyer and commentator, Conservative peer Lord Marland, and political commentator Esther Krakue. Thank you, all three of you, for being here. And I'm going to put you on the spot, Lord Marland, and start...
I thought it should be ladies first. Surely.
Well, you know what? As you're a Conservative peer, and we could well be seeing the Conservative government about to be in for a historic wipeout, and I'm sorry to say that, but that is the way the polls have been pointing. How would you describe their performance?
Well, firstly, I never believe the polls.
Go on. Why?
So, well, they've got it wrong so often, and they got it horrendously wrong recently, of course, in India. So I never believe the polls, so we'll see what the outcome is. I think Rishi Sunak's done a very good job, actually. He had a very bad and difficult set of cards to play with. He's turned the economy around, he's got cost of living down, and he's tried his very best on the immigration issues, despite the weight of Labour and the legal profession trying to stop him doing things, and indeed the civil service. I think if you look back at the time that he's had, there has been this disconnect between the civil service and the ministers, which has got worse rather than better. Galvanising the civil service into work has been a real problem for the government, as we've seen. And if they're not working for you, having been a minister myself, it's very difficult to get them going. So I think that's been something very difficult for him. Clearly the government is tired. There are a lot of ministers there who've been in work for a very long time, and being a minister is an incredibly tiring job. It's terrible. It's crisis management day after day after day, and it is exhausting. And they look very tired, and a lot of them have decided not to stand again because they are tired. So I think it is a tired government, but I think Rishi's done incredibly well trying to get the thing back on track.
Paula, do you think that's a fair assessment?
Absolutely not. And of course, I don't feel at all sorry for any of Rishi Sunak's government, anybody that he worked for, Rishi Sunak himself. The people who I feel sorry for are the people who had to pull their teeth out because they can't get an NHS dentist. The people I feel sorry for are the people whose children who are suffering with their mental health and cannot access the help that they need so desperately. The people I feel sorry for are the nurses, are the junior doctors, are the consultants, are the paediatricians, are the GPs, are the paramedics. Those are the people who I've been feeling sorry for. The people who are working but are having to still claim benefits because they cannot afford to feed their children.
But the question wasn't about whether I felt sorry for I do feel sorry for those people. The question was, what did I think about Rishi Sunak's government, not about the people I feel sorry for. Of course, we all feel very sorry for those people.
Well, what I think about Rishi Sunak's government, it's the disunited kingdom. That's what Rishi Sunak's government has done. We are no longer a united country. We seem to focus on the differences between us instead of trying to work together, to understand each other, to come together. And that's what has really concerned me about this government.
Let's bring in Esther, because I think it's fair to call you a Conservative commentator. You've generally sided with the Conservatives in the past. Do you still feel that way?
I think this is the thing, because I identify as a small c Conservative. However, I'm a regular critic of the Conservative Party because they are not in any way, shape or form Conservative. I do think there's a fair point to be made about the lack of neutrality with the civil service, and I think that's one of the legacies of the Blair era, which actually basically didn't penalise civil servants from not being politically neutral. I actually know many senior civil servants who spoke about the joy of working under Blair and all of that, and they just couldn't make things work with the Conservative government. But the question I had for them was, this is your job. You know, you're supposed to not really care who's in power. Your job is to be a civil servant and to make the state tick. And I think it was from the attitude of those senior civil servants that I actually recognised there was an issue there. That being said, that does not negate I would say, the lack of competence of many senior Tory politicians, and I think that mainly has to do with the leadership of the party and what the party actually stands for. And yes, Paul is right. The country has had to suffer for it because, yes, we can criticise the politicians at the top at the end of the day, but the people who are really bearing the brunt of that are the people who are finding it difficult to feed their children, or people that are wondering what happened to Brexit, what happened to the free trade deals, why am I dealing with more regulations in certain industries than even before Brexit, when the whole point of it was to decide our future and become Singapore on Thames, or what a take you had on Brexit. So there's a lot of sort of lack of forward thinking across the board.
You mentioned leadership there, Esther. Let's think about then leaders, because a lot of people bring up the name Boris Johnson, despite the fact that he left in some disgrace from number 10 Downing Street. He was essentially ousted after the COVID Partygate investigations. But the Conservative Party actually sort of, I think I could say, wheeled him out in the final days.
Dug him up.
And
stunned him back to life.
Pressed the Boris button at the last moment, and he came out and campaigned for Sunak. Lord Marland, do you think it was a bit late in the day?
No, I don't think that's totally fair that it was late in the day, because he had been doing quite a lot of social media and supporting a lot of candidates in seats. So he has been out there. You know, there clearly was tension between Sunak and Johnson, and Sunak didn't reach out to Boris in the way that perhaps encouraged Boris as much as he could have done. But also, you know, Boris is not universally popular for the reasons which I mean, people feel incredibly angry about him for the parties and some of the things like that. So he's not necessarily the greatest asset that you would want, and so I can understand that. In that he wasn't called back, but he is very, very popular, as you say, with a certain sector.
Well, we've been focusing quite a lot in our coverage over the last 48 hours or so about popularity and populism, and what does populism look like in the UK. Another very popular figure for some is Nigel Farage. Paula, can you see why?
Yes, and what I see is the failure of Brexit. Ultimately, what I see is the failure of those who would consider themselves working class to feel that they somehow benefited over the last 14 years. We heard, of course, about the VIP lanes during COVID, and yet there were, as I've said already, people who can't find an NHS dentist, can't get to see their GP. And so I can completely understand how Nigel Farage, who is essentially selling us snake oil, he's able to tap into the emotions of how sad, bad, angry, frustrated a lot of the voters are feeling, and he can sell them the world without having to promise them a delivery in terms of that.
Could he deliver, Esther, Nigel Farage?
This is the interesting thing, because now it's not just about him. I mean, he is obviously the face of reform, but he's trying to work with this kind of machine that's very new, has no infrastructure in place. And in many ways, I compare him to Marine Le Pen. The reason, even though their politics are slightly different, I think she leans more very left on economically speaking, and Nigel Farage, even though we didn't know much of his politics outside of get us out of the EU, has now kind of posited himself in the firm, like sort of liberal economic sense, right-wing, socially conservative. The question is whether he is dealing with a serious machine, a serious political machine. If he doesn't even win a seat in Clacton, first of all, we're not going to be speaking about him anymore. But if he's going to gain the same sort of populist momentum that Marine Le Pen has, there are many questions. The man is in his 60s, which by American standards is not old. It's actually a toddler. But
Certainly isn't old being in your
exactly.
60s.
He's not going. He cannot be the same force that he wants to be in 10 years' time. You have to pass the baton to someone who is a young sort of person of his ilk in British politics now that could possibly succeed him. We know that Marine Le Pen has managed to secure someone like that. There's no one on the horizon for that in Britain. And we know that it takes a long time to develop a reputation and to become someone that's not been tainted in the public image. So there are many questions as to whether Nigel Farage is actually running a serious political machine here. But Paula said, I understand his appeal.
Yeah, or is he just trying to get himself back in the good books with
I was going to ask Lord Marland that.
Yeah.
Do you think we could see Farage coalescing with the Conservative Party once again?
Well, there's always been an anti-Farage leadership of the Conservative Party. None of them have wanted to work with Farage. I think it's been a mistake, actually. We should have done a deal with Nigel about a year ago and offered him... He was clearly flirting with the party. He hadn't...
He's flirting with Priti Patel, wasn't he?
Yeah,
Which
was hard to watch.
not just pretty, but he was flirting with the party, and the party didn't take the opportunity to embrace him. And my sense has always been that if you are fighting a very tough election or a very tough battle, you really want to get all the side of the right flank on your side in order to do it, and I think they've missed a great opportunity there.
And I think
it's a controversial thing to say, by the way, amongst Conservatives, but I think so. He is an incredibly charismatic character. He is one of the major standout politicians of the last 20, 30 years. He's got that X factor. He does connect with people. I don't agree he's a snake oil salesman, but I think he's a formidable political figure and can't be ignored and won't be ignored. So I think that was a mistake. As to the future, well, it rather depends what the result turns out to be. I think he's going to find it very, very difficult being in Parliament. If he ends up with 5, 6, 7, 10 fellow Reform members, you're in opposition for 4 or 5 years, not really being able to make any headway because of the parliamentary process. And being in opposition, I was in opposition in the House of Lords for a couple of years, is not much fun.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about who have been the opposition. Labour, who could be set to take government on Friday. We don't know yet. We'll have to wait the results. If they do, certain quarters of the UK are calling this Starmer-geddon. That's the right-hand side of things because of the leader, Keir Starmer. Paula, do you think that's a fair analysis of what Labour is going to be like in this country? Will they be able to achieve much?
I would prefer to reference his of Sir Keir Sparkles. You might remember when he had his party conference and glitter was thrown all over him, and
he was actually very composed then. That was one of those moments where I was like, it helps to be boring because he didn't make a fuss.
And
I was quite
rose
surprised.
To that occasion.
I was surprised by that.
Because technically speaking, in terms of what some of our MPs have faced in regards to threats, etc., on their life, it was for a split second. It would have been a very scary moment for him. And whilst I put light on calling him Sir Keir Sparkles, what I'm hoping is actually that the areas of our hopefully united country will come together and see that he can be a positive force, a force for good, as for one of separating and dividing.
Esther.
I think it's interesting because we've just been speaking about reform, and actually I think the biggest threat to Labour are actually reform, because and this is assuming the polls are right, in areas where reform is posing the biggest threat, it's actually not in Tory-held seats. It's actually in red wall, traditionally Labour voting seats. And I think if, again, there's many ifs here, if Nigel Farage can get some sort of foothold in Parliament, he will be the biggest threat to Keir Starmer. Because while he will likely have a supermajority and it will take many MPs to peel off any significant support of Keir Starmer, the sentiment around the blue wall seats that the Labour Party will win back will quickly sour. Because just like George Galloway, Nigel Farage will have a certain type of appeal, not necessarily economically, but in terms of social conservatism, in terms of British nationalism, in terms of even harking back to Brexit, which is now a poison chalice, but saying, actually, I pushed this, but it didn't go the way that I wanted. Give us a chance.
And I don't have a problem with that per se in terms of meeting that unhappy voice head on. And I think it's important, isn't it, for democracy to ensure that those unhappy voices are heard. What concerns me with this kind of, you know, Starmageddon-esque is what we then also see is the racism and the negativity and the homophobia that we have seen in the recent weeks. That's what concerns me.
Another essence behind Starmageddon, Lord Marland, some suggest that Labour are waiting to take power and then they're suddenly going to become a socialist, as some would call it, threat within the United Kingdom, that they're sort of characterising themselves as being centrist, but once they're in power, they're going to put forward some really progressive policy points. Do you think that's fair?
Well, there's nothing wrong with progressive policy points, but rather on the similar theme as you two have enunciated, I think it would be a big mistake to have a class war, a really big mistake. This country needs pulling together. It's all very well running in Clacton, where there is a point of view, but this country is a very complex, multicultural society now, and it's totally different across the piece. And so the incoming government has got to really steady the ship. It's got to not have a class war by attacking school fees or stopping hunting. I mean, Tony Blair always regrets taking on the countryside with the hunting bill. No one needs this. What we need to do is get the productivity back into the country, get the country working again. Increasing productivity means that you can actually spend more money on social services and etc. At the moment, we're spending more than we earn. We're taxed the highest we've been taxed since the war, and we're almost at breaking point of tax. And if you attack the people who are creating the wealth, we're going to Dubai, you know, or we're going to some other country, and the brain drain happens as it did under Labour in the 70s.
It's already happening.
Yes.
Yeah, and it is already happening, but it will be the middle classes, of which I am happily one, will be thinking, where do we go? Where can we get our employment? And because I'm not going to carry on in this country with the social issues you've been talking about very correctly, and also the tax burden and the inevitable costs and the regulation. I mean, the regulation is absolutely ridiculous. It's just stifling any form of growth. So if they've got any sense, they'll think about that, and then when they've redressed the balance sheet, it'll be fine. If they don't, then it'll be a short-term.
Unfortunately, we have to leave things there. But before we wrap up this conversation, I want to put you on the spot one more time and ask you your predictions for what you think is going to happen when we get the votes in. Who do you think is going to be the winner in this, Esther?
Of course, the Labour Party. I do think they're going to have something of a supermajority. But I also think that Keir Starmer will have a problem with that, actually. Even though a supermajority sounds like the ideal situation, you could have very powerful factions within that could pose problems for him and divide the country more than unite it.
Lord Marland, your prediction?
Well, I think it's hard to predict, but I've said from the beginning, so I'm not going to change it now, that I think the Conservatives will get 150 seats upwards. I could be totally wrong, of course, but you know, I've said it. So I've said it.
We'll check tomorrow. We'll check it against your prediction. And Paula, what's your prediction?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking 150 seats. That's what I've said previously.
You really are clever.
Excellent taste.
The winner is going to be one of three people: Suella Braverman, Priti Patel, or Kemi Badenoch.
Taking the Conservative Party into the future, you think? Female-led. Interesting.
Yeah.
We shall have to invite you all back if you're correct, and congratulate you all. Look, we appreciate your time. Esther, Lord Marland, Paula, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Well, that wraps up The UK Decides, our special coverage of the UK election for today. But make sure you join us again here tomorrow. Hit the subscribe button on YouTube to get the latest updates, because we'll be back with another one of our special general election shows, looking at all the reaction to who the British public have decided to vote into government for the United Kingdom. Don't miss it, and we'll see you again tomorrow.